So it's just great to have everybody here who could make it into the hall, and great to have so many of you on Zoom as well. And it feels like it is an opening out, a bit of a start of spring, hopefully, and of more people being able to come to the centre. So we've been thinking about how to, what we want to do over the spring and summer. And what we're doing is we're having a number of events that we're calling Building the Buddha Land. So it's about creating a strong Sangha based on the Dharma, with the Bodhisattva ideal at the very heart of it, and giving people a chance, if they want to meet in the garden, to work together on Sangha works days, or maybe with groups of friends, or just with somebody else when you want to. We've got a lovely long list of things that need doing in the garden, which is looking really beautiful at the moment, actually, but there's a lot more that could be done. So we've got Sangha Works Days this Friday and on Monday. There's going to be lunch from Pete, so that should be pretty good. Does it start at 10 o'clock, Mike Shivasan? Starts at 10, yeah? Till 4. So please do come, even if you can't come from the whole day. It'd be really nice to see you. We'll make sure it's properly socially distanced, masks inside, but a chance to work both outside and inside the centre. So hopefully see some of you there. And then also look out for other events that we're going to be running as well outside. Okay, so I'm really pleased today that we're inviting, Sanghagita is going to give the talk as part of this series that we're doing on the 5 great stages of the path.
Hello, thank you. So yeah, we are doing the 5 great stages of the path of spiritual practice. Integration makes us more whole, makes us more consistent. Positive emotion, more robust, more skillful mental states, warmer, more open mental states. And coming from a place of integration and positive emotion, as we approach spiritual death and spiritual rebirth, we recognize them, we recognize spiritual death, spiritual rebirth, and we're big enough to hold what happens in the next 2 stages. And it's how we change. So this talk is about the importance of positive emotion, metta, generosity, faith, compassion. And we need a strong foundation in these to step into spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. The person in this story came to this in one devastating event. And the story of Kisa Gotami, I bet if I asked you who knows the story, you'd put your hand up. Yeah. If you haven't heard the story of Kisa Gotami, you're in for a treat. It's a fantastic story, one of the most moving and beautiful stories in the canon. And if you have heard it before, I would encourage you to come to the story as if you've never heard it before, because in a way, none of us have. I'm giving the talk, and in a way, this person here has never heard the story of Kisa Gotami, even though I'm telling it. So we're all new to it. So it comes from the Therigatha, which is a collection of 73 stories about women who lived at the time of the Buddha, who became enlightened as his disciples. And it's about one of them whose birth name was Gotama Tissa. And it was kind of a really cruel nickname that she got of Kisa Gotami. Kisa means skinny, poor, haggard, connotations of low status and poverty. And so she was called Kisa Gotami. And her family never expected her to marry. Her family expected her to be a drain on the family, good looks and wealth she didn't have. But amazingly, she did manage to get a husband, and her family, she married into the family of quite a well-off merchant. And so as a new bride, she went off to live with her in-laws, which was traditional, probably still is. And unfortunately, her life with her in-laws was very unhappy. She was treated like a servant, like a slave, actually. And often in those days, as it was traditional for brides to move into the in-laws' households, they were often very unhappy. They were beaten often, and there were lots of incidences of suicide. She was very unhappy. The sutta said the family scorned her. and called her the daughter of a nobody. And maybe she was resented because she didn't have a dowry. And the one thing she could do to lift herself out of servitude was to get pregnant, to have a baby, and for that baby to be a boy. And people thought she'd never do it because she was so thin, and she was so kind of unhealthy looking that nobody really expected that of her, but she did. Can you imagine the relief and the joy when she had a baby boy? And she absolutely adored the child. I mean, she adored the baby for himself because he was gorgeous and she loved him and he was her baby. But she adored him because of the gift he gave her. Now that she was no longer the daughter of a nobody, she was the mother of somebody. She was an important mother to the heir of the family. And she could really hold her head up in the family, in the neighboring families, and in the village. And her life completely changed. And she was much, much happier and much more stable, feeling much more stable and settled in the family. And we know what happens next. The sutta says, running back and forth and all around while playing, he met his end. And I imagine that maybe he stood on a rusty nail or something, or fell out of a tree and banged his head, or broke a limb or something like that. He died. And the sutta says, sorrow to the point of madness arose in her. And taking the corpse on her hip, she ran around the city from door to door, pleading, give me medicine for my son, he's sick. And people reviled her, saying, what good is medicine? They could see he was dead. She couldn't. Taking the body, they tried to take the body from her, but she clung to his little frame and staggering around the city, going from person to person, asking for medicine, asking for help. People began to just turn away from her contemptuously. And then eventually a kind man took pity on her. And he saw how desperate she was and said, there is somebody who can help you. And he directed her to the Buddha, who was staying outside of Shravasti in the deer park. And she ran as fast as she could with her child. And I just imagine her bursting in to the scene. The Buddha was sitting, teaching with all his disciples in front of him. I can imagine the kind of silence and serenity of the moment, and she bursts in. And that moment when they all kind of take a deep breath and take in what's going on. And, they can see that the child is dead and she's asking for help. And they know that the Buddha will tell her the truth. Of course, he's going to tell her the truth, but how on earth is he going to deal with this? And she kneels at his feet and says, I need medicine for my child. Can you help me? And he says, yes, I can help you. And she answers, what must I do? What must I do? And he says, you need to bring me a mustard seed. Can you imagine the relief of that? Everyone has mustard seed. Everyone had that in their kitchens, and she knew she could get it. And as she was leaving to go, he said, but there is a condition. The mustard seed must come from a house where nobody has died. And thinking about the first part of the deal, she thinks that's easy, and she runs as fast as she can back to Shravasti. But on the outskirts of the city were a group of houses, like a little hamlet. And she runs to the first house and knocks on the door impatiently and asks for mustard seed. And the woman who answers the door says, yes, of course, come in. Yeah, here it is, and gives her the mustard seed. And Gotami remembers what she must ask, and she asks, this must come from a house where nobody has died. And then immediately the woman takes back the mustard seed and tells her about her husband only last year had died, and her father who had died when she was a child. And in those days, families lived in one house for generations and generations. So, her asking that brought back lots of memories of bereavement and grief that she'd experienced. But this woman was no good to go to me. She's no good. Go to the next house. So she knocked on the next house. And again, she asked for the mustard seed, which was easily granted. And as she went to take it, she asked, but it must come from a house where nobody has died. And again, the woman remembers her sister who had died and her own child that she was still grieving the loss of. Again, this woman was no good to her. She ran to the next house, and again, the story was the same. Easy to give the mustard seed. But then, remembering the stories of their own loss, Kisa Gotami came up against sadness again and again, and memories of loss and grief. So she'd been to all of the houses. She wasn't able to get her mustard seed from those houses there. And she stood on the road, back on the road to Shravasti. In one direction was Shravasti with more houses to knock on, more possibilities of getting the mustard seed. And in the other direction was the Buddha. And in that moment, a change came over her. And the sutta said, her madness left her, and her right mind was established. And she thought, this is the way it will be in the entire city. This is not a truth for one village or town, nor is it a truth for a single family, but for every world settled by gods and human beings. This is indeed what is true, impermanence. And I stood on that road. I've stood on that road between Shravasti and the Deer Park, maybe on the very spot that Kisa Gotami stood on. And I can remembering the story and watching women with children on their hips or on their backs or carrying them, walking up and down that road. And I've seen the little houses that were there, maybe the same descendants of the same families 2,600 years ago. And the presence of Kisa Gotami's discovery and her truth reverberated down the centuries. And I thought, I've been in that situation. At the time, I actually was in that situation, but I'll tell you about that a bit later. So the Buddha's genius was that Gotami had to listen to people. She had to connect to people. People stopped being cardboard cutouts and objects that could either give her the mustard seed or not. She had to go beyond herself and listen and connect with people who had suffered just like she had. And through that listening and connecting and stopping and just being present to the stories that she was hearing, it dawned on her that we're all connected in death, all connected, and compassion arose in her. So she turned away from Shravasti, and before she did anything else, she went and buried her little boy in the charnel ground. And I imagine in that moment, possibly all she felt was the grief and the sadness and the loss of her little boy. And all of the other terror and fear and not wanting to acknowledge what had happened had melted away in that moment of seeing the truth of impermanence. So who knows which came first? Seeing clearly the universal nature of the suffering that she was in contact with every time she spoke to somebody in the doorway, or positive emotion of compassion. But when she stopped focusing on herself and connected with others, wisdom and compassion arose together. And she was able to let in the truth with that compassion that she had, with the positive emotion that she was embodying. She was able to let in the truth and all it might mean. The terrible cruelty of blame, possibly from her family, terrible guilt, possible return to servitude and slavery within the household. But the compassion that she was able to embody made her a big enough vessel so that she could hear the truth. And after burying her child, she knew where she must go. And when she returned to the Buddha, the Kisa Gotami that she had been was dead. And her need for status and opinion was gone. And she knelt before the Buddha in one of the most beautiful exchanges of all of the stories. And he gently says to her, "Have you obtained the mustard seed, Gotami?" And she says, "The little mustard seed has done its work. Finished is the matter of the mustard seed." And she went forth from her old life and she asked for ordination. And as the Buddha spoke to her about impermanence and death, she became a stream entrant in that moment. She became a nun. Well, she became a bhikkhuni in the Buddhist Sangha and became enlightened, continuing to connect with positive emotion all the way to the big one of enlightenment. And when my marriage ended in 2017, my world completely fell apart, even though it was what I wanted. When it became a reality, a madness arose in me. And I clung to the life that I had, the life that I had built. It wasn't just sadness, it wasn't just grief. It was anger and hatred and terror. And I completely lost my mind in the same way as Kisa Gotami lost her mind. I couldn't bear to let in the truth that that life was over forever, and there was no way back. And for a while, I staggered around, like Kisa Gotami, having doorway conversations. Everywhere there were reminders of the life I'd had. You know what it's like, songs in the supermarket. Order events that were, she's an order member, gifts that she'd given me that I'd come across by accident, common friends, anniversaries, birthdays, clothes, the light, the certain way the light is sometimes, smells, things I'd be doing in the kitchen would suddenly bring it all back. And, completely thrown from again and again and again, completely thrown into not wanting to believe that it was true, that it was over and it was never coming back. And then in a meditation, in a strong meditation, I saw that I had been thinking all along that she was mine, that was possible to own somebody, that she was mine, and I'd been focused on my own happiness and what I could get out of that relationship for me. And I see parallels with Kisa Gotami. There was love, obviously love there, but still there was this idea of ownership of another human being, which obviously doesn't make sense. So I was standing on the road to Shravasti, clinging to my old life one way. It couldn't be over. There had to be something that could bring that back. And in the other way, in the other direction, the Buddha. And the truth that it was over. And whilst it couldn't be over, I was stuck in fear and anger and unskillful mental states and all of the harm that I was doing to myself and other people. And I had a very strong faith, and I chose the Buddha. And I knelt at his feet, and it wasn't in a moment thing like Kisa Gotami. It took me 2 years. But in that light, in those 2 years, I practiced positive emotion like my life depended on it. The Metta Bhavana, going on retreat, talking to my friends, doing stuff in the Sangha. And the meditation experience connected me with the truth of interconnectedness, that no person can own another. Nobody can be mine because we are deeply and profoundly interconnected. And there isn't in that way a separate selves that can own anything. It was as if Kisa Gotami's little boy had a role that he had to play for her in the same way as she had a role to make me happy. And when that was broken open, when that practice of positive emotion broke all that open, the practice of metta, of faith, generosity, made me go beyond myself. And now I want her to be happy for her own sake, whatever that looks like. And things have really changed. Happy ending. like Kisa Gotami, but I'm not enlightened. So that was a really big one. It was a really big one. But life is absolutely full of opportunities to step in like this. And we have loads and loads of opportunities for small deaths, leading all the way to the big one. And they can sometimes feel quite big as well. At the moment, I've engaged in the practice of taking Sydney, Dharma Mai's dog, for a walk every Wednesday. Because it's generous, you know, it's a nice thing to do and it helps Dharma Mai, and that's nice, and I can get to know Sydney a bit. But mostly because I absolutely hate dog poo. Absolutely hate it. On the verge of phobia. Oh, ugh. I absolutely hate it. And I thought, I don't want to be the kind of person who can't take a dog for a walk because I hate dog poo. I just thought that's not good enough. I can't say that to Dharma Mai. I can't take your dog for a walk and help you because I don't like dog poo. It's just not on. So I have started to take him, and it's getting easier. I still don't love it, you know, it's not great, but it's getting easier. And the generosity, the positive emotion of that generosity allows me to step into the possibility of being somebody different, of being somebody who actually doesn't mind either way. So these are the small things we can do. Whenever we find ourselves in the gap and we choose skillful action, we're cultivating positive emotion and stepping into a version of ourselves which is less focused on what's in it for me, cultivating what Vedanya calls a warm-hearted solidarity with all beings. And talking of poo, it's a bit like positive emotion is the compost out of which can bloom spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. Generosity, metta, faith, these positive emotions that give us a solid foundation so that we can be big enough vessels to step into those scary spaces where aspects of us have to die. So it's great when you feel inspired, isn't it? It's really great when you feel inspired, that you're in touch with your desire to change, and you're in touch with that, with your positive emotion, and you feel like you can step in and do something different in the gap. You feel like you can do something skillful and step into spiritual death and spiritual rebirth in that way. And these are the times when we need to do what I kind of think of as ambushing your future self. So sowing the seeds of positive emotion into the future, because we all have periods in our practice, in our Dharma life, when we're not that inspired, when things are flat and grey and we're not really kind of into it as much, and we don't really want to come to Sangha night like we used to, and we're not meditating like we used to every day. And these are the times when we need our past self to have done something brilliant for us and booked us on retreat, or booked us on an event at the centre way into the future, or put something in the diary that when we're feeling inspired, we've booked for and planned for, making dates with wise friends into the future, so that when we're feeling a bit flat, we're kind of forced into doorway conversations in the same way as Kisa Gotami was. And if we, in that way, we're much more likely to be able to step into these opportunities for spiritual death and spiritual rebirth, if we're in touch with our skillful action, positive emotion. So if you're feeling inspired, remember to ambush your future self and sow seeds of positive emotion into the future. So what do we do, when we're on the road to Shravasti? If it's just in the gap between wanting to have a biscuit that we know we've kind of promised ourselves that we weren't going to have, and deciding not to. Those little gaps that we all know are there. if we're hanging on by our fingernails, like I was in that big one, the big experience that I've described to you, and I was really, really struggling. Everything had fallen apart, and I was standing on the road to travesty. You know, in those moments when we've got, you know, what do we hold on to? Do we keep knocking on the same old doors, doing what we've always done? Or do we turn to something? Do we turn to something more positive, something more skillful? Do we kneel at the feet of the Buddha? So the next talks in the series are about saying more about spiritual death and spiritual rebirth. And we have to kind of think about, what do we need to let go of? What are we carrying on our hip? What is it that we could really do with letting go of? So Kisa Gotami did go on and become enlightened. And oh, hang on. Yeah, she did, and it's so fantastic. It's so amazing to think that we have these records. We have this, you know, written by this woman, who, by the story that I've told you, know, she went on, and we have a record of the poetry that she wrote when she was enlightened. I think that's absolutely amazing. So I'm going to read you one of her poems, and then that's the end of the talk. A child dead, and a mad search for a magic seed. It's a story as old as dust. Brave up, my friends. The day will come when you run from house to house. People will meet you at the door, look you in the eye, and they won't let you in. I'm sorry, they'll say, but we can't help you. Listen. When everyone you love is gone, when everything you have has been taken away, you'll find the path waiting underneath every rock on the road. These are the words of Kisa Gotami.